Hello, today we're going to start our first lesson on factoring, and that's called factoring using the distributive property. In this first type of factoring, we're going to basically be undoing the distributive property. So you're used to seeing a question like 2 times parentheses x plus 10, and you know that when you see a problem like this, to simplify, we typically distribute the 2 into the parentheses. Distributing is a type of multiplying, so we multiply into the parentheses and get something like 2x plus 20. However, today we're going to start factoring, which is the opposite of that. Today we're going to start with 2x plus 20 and break it down into smaller pieces, factor it into something like 2 times parentheses x plus 10. Since factoring is like the opposite of doing the distributive property, when we factor, we're going to divide out terms, the opposite of distributing, opposite of multiplying. When we factor using the distributive property, we're going to factor out or divide out the GCF from each of our terms, and we're going to put what's left over inside of parentheses. We can always check our answers by distributing back into the parentheses and making sure we get back to the original problem. If you take a look at something like question number 1, it says factor each polynomial. So we're going to start by figuring out the GCF. So the GCF, the greatest common factor, is the biggest number that divides into all of your terms. So if I take a look at the problem here, I'm going to start just with the numbers. So 9 and 36, the biggest number that divides into both 9 and 36 is 9. Then if I compare x squared to x, the biggest number of x's that they both have is just 1x. So my greatest common factor is 9x. That's what I'm going to factor from each of these terms. So I'm going to start by putting my GCF in front of a set of parentheses. To figure out what goes into those parentheses, I divide each term by 9x. So when I take the first term and I divide it by 9x, 9 divided by 9 is just 1. X squared divided by x is x. So that leftover goes in the parentheses. Then I carry down the plus sign. I divide the second term by my GCF, 9x. 36 divided by 9 is 4. X divided by x cancels out. This is my final answer. This is what the factored form looks like. 9x times parentheses x plus 4. Out front, it shows my GCF, and then inside, it shows what's left once I took out the GCF from each term. Okay, for question number 2, we're going to factor out the GCF. So first, we have to figure out what the greatest common factor is. Again, go piece by piece, number by number, letter by letter. So between 16 and 40, the biggest number that divides into both 16 and 40 is 8. Then I have an x in each term, so that's a greatest common factor. Then I have 1z in the first term and z squared in the second term, so they each have a z. So my GCF is 8xz. Again, I'm going to put that in front of parentheses. So I show what I factor out. And then I divide each term by that GCF. So for the first term, 16 divided by 8 is 2. The leftovers go in the parentheses. X divided by x cancels out. Z divided by z cancels out. Then I have minus. Now for the second term, when I divide by the GCF, 40 divided by 8 is 5. X divided by x cancels. Z squared divided by z is z. This is my final answer. In question number 3, the greatest common factor between 14 and 18, the biggest number that divides into each of them, is just a 2. Then if I look at the g's, the first term has a g, but the second one does not. So I cannot take that out of each term. Then both terms have an h, so I can take an h from each term. So my GCF is 2h. I put that in front of parentheses. Divide each term by that GCF. So for the first term, 14 divided by 2 is 7. The g does not get divided by anything, so I just recopy it. H divided by h cancels out. Then I have minus. In the second term, 18 divided by 2 is 9. And h divided by h cancels out. So my final answer, 2h times 7g minus 9. Okay, in question number 4, notice that we have 3 terms. When we find the greatest common factor, we still have to look for something that divides into all 3 terms. And when I look at the last term here, it's just a plain old x. So the only possible thing I could take from every term is an x. And I double check that yes, every single term has at least one x. So that's my greatest common factor. So I'm going to take an x out of each term. I put that in front of parentheses. Divide everything by x. So in the first term, 15 stays the same. X squared divided by x is x. And the y squared stays as it is. Then I have a plus sign. When I divide the second term by x, 25 stays as it is. X divided by x cancels. I copy the y. And for my last term, when I divide by x, x divided by x cancels out, but x divided by x is really 1. You have to have that placeholder of 1 at the end here. You can't leave plus nothing. So be careful. If all of the terms ever cancel out, you have to put down that placeholder of 1. Okay, tonight's homework is down at the bottom of this. This homework assignment is due on Monday. We're starting our block scheduling next week, but since we meet during period 3, you're going to have algebra on Monday. So I will talk to you then. Have a great day. Please make sure you show all of your work in your homework.